Charles J. Guiteau is one of the only 4 people to successfully assassinate a president of the United States. However, he isn't as brought up as much compared to others such as John Wilkes Booth and Lee Harvey Oswald. That said, Guiteau is definitely not one to be underestimated or ignored. His borderline psychopathic actions throughout his life, from believing himself as the Messiah from God to eventually murdering the president in cold blood, make him truly stand out among the rest to be reviewed and analyzed. Today, we will be covering the life of Charles J. Guiteau, his deep obsession with religion, his mental instability, and most importantly, his seemingly never-ending egotism. This is his story. Charles Julius Guiteau was born on September 8, 1841, to Jane Howie and Luther Wilson Guiteau. Throughout most of his life, Guiteau had a pretty grandiose sense of self-worth, but also seemed to be a bit of an oddball while growing up. His father was extremely religious and strict, and this is probably where his religious faith and persecution complex had birthed from. His mother, on the other hand, who had her own mental instability, died when he was only 7 years old. However, at a young age, it was pretty clear that Guiteau believed highly of himself, and he, in his own words, was ambitious to be somebody. When he became a young man, Guiteau was sent off to college, but soon ditched it after his dad kept raving about this religious sect called the Oneida community. Guiteau would join the sect, but it proved to be more difficult than he expected. He would often perform a lot of manual labor he thought was beneath him. He also became upset that no one acknowledged his true intellect, that he had been sent down by God himself and no one even noticed. Needless to say, this mentality of self-importance alienated Guiteau from basically most people. He wasn't particularly popular, especially with the women who often made fun of him. After a few years, he would leave the sect altogether in favor of attempting his own newspaper, which never got off the ground. After failing miserably at that, he would return to Oneida. However, he would soon leave again for similar reasons prior. He would also file a lawsuit against Oneida's founder John Humphrey Noyes for compensation for his work, which he felt he was owed. This would be a common theme throughout Guiteau's story. After Oneida, Guiteau worked as a bill collector attorney. He would often pocket portions of the money he collected for himself, which got him into some hot water and landed him briefly in jail. During this period, he also met and married a woman named Annie Bunn. However, their relationship was extremely turbulent, as Guiteau was physically and mentally abusive, and she would eventually leave him 4 years later. Also during this period, Guiteau took an interest in everybody's favorite pastime, politics. Guiteau had fully supported Horace Greeley against then-incumbent Republican President Ulysses S. Grant. He prepared a speech that has been described as extremely disjointed and unfocused. However, Guiteau was still determined. He believed that if Greeley won, he would most certainly appoint Guiteau a political seat in his administration, as Guiteau was well-educated and had plenty of experience to back it up. At least, that's what Guiteau believed. Did the support help? No, it did not. Grant won the election by a landslide against Greeley, who would unfortunately die a month later. Turning back to religion for a time, he would give sermons to his church, which mostly consisted of him babbling nonsense to anyone willing to actually listen. Adding more to his delusion, he was involved in a freak steamboat accident in the summer of 1880, when his boat collided with another and there were many casualties. However, Guiteau survived and believed himself to be divinely spared for a higher purpose. The boating accident wasn't the only major event to happen to Guiteau in 1880. It was also the same year as the presidential elections. Although he opposed Grant in the previous election, he eventually came around to him. Guiteau had become Republican, specifically aligning himself with the faction known as the Stalwarts, who supported Ulysses S. Grant, against fellow Republican James G. Blaine, who is another important character in this story by the way, also ran the other Republican faction known as the Half-Breeds. Guiteau has solidified himself as a true advocate for the former president for what would be his third non-consecutive term. He failed. Grant lost the Republican nomination to one James A. Garfield, a representative and lawyer from Ohio. Guiteau, after learning this, simply changed the name from Grant to Garfield. While there were some minor alterations, it was the exact same speech that very few people actually listened to or read. Garfield narrowly won the election and was slated to become the 20th president of the United States. His supporters were elated, especially Guiteau. After all, it was thanks to him that Garfield even won the election in the first place. At least, That's what Guiteau believed. During the early parts of Garfield's tenure, Guiteau had traveled to Washington and would send multiple letters to the White House in hopes that Garfield and Blaine, who was newly appointed to Secretary of State, would grant Guiteau counsel position under Garfield's new administration. He had planned for Austria, but later changed his mind to Paris. He sent them many letters with high hopes, enthusiastically waiting for a response. And kept waiting, and kept waiting, and kept waiting, and kept waiting. Needless to say, most of the messages were either ignored or not even opened. Undeterred, however, Guiteau simply went to the White House and spoke to the president directly. How times have changed. While all this was going down, Guiteau had traveled from boarding house to boarding house and generally being a pain in the rear. One such occasion had Guiteau at a boarding home that he had resided in for several weeks, but had never paid for his living expenses, all the while freeloading off the staff and spewing how he was the chosen one. Typical Guiteau behavior. When understandably confronted to pay up, he claimed that the bill was paid for by Illinois Senator John A. Logan. When later asked if this were true, Logan denied it, probably to the surprise of no one. After this revelation, the owner, again understandably, proceeded to kick Guiteau out, but not before he asked him not to mention this little skirmish publicly as to not ruin his reputation. Regardless, Guiteau met with the president in person about his contributions to Garfield's campaign, specifically his speech. As a thank you for Guiteau's rigorous work, he should appoint him as a consul general for Paris. Garfield, while humoring Guiteau, was clearly not taking the man seriously, nor remotely interested in giving him the position. But Guiteau wouldn't just stop there. No, he would also visit, and when I mean by visit I mean pester and harass, Blaine on a regular basis about the Paris consulship. This back and forth lasted for quite a while until Blaine had had enough. He finally laid into Guiteau for who he really was, an obsessive, entitled bum who would never get his consulship in Paris. For Blaine, it was the end of the conversation, a sharp but necessary truth that Guiteau needed to accept and move on from. However, for Guiteau, this was a devastating blow to his entire plan, supposed career, and most crucially, his ego. He was hurt, but more importantly enraged over being snubbed a position in his mind rightfully belonged to him. After getting chewed out by Blaine, and his supposed chances of ever having an office being destroyed, to say that Guiteau began to spiral out of control would be a severe understatement. He would then proceed to spam letters to the White House urging Garfield to fire Blaine for supposed improper conduct. However, these, like the rest of the letters before, were ignored, which further enraged Guiteau, and his mental health had continued to deteriorate and his persecution complex only grew. As time went on, Guiteau had begun believing that not only was Blaine corrupt, but that the entire Republican Party had been torn and distorted from its former glory. And in Guiteau's eyes, there was only one man to blame for it all: President Garfield himself. He was destroying the country, Guiteau felt. He believed it to be a divine intervention from God himself, that by removing him, it would save the United States from imploding into itself. But in order to do that, Garfield must be killed, and Vice President Chester A. Arthur be his successor. In Guiteau's eyes, there was no other option. As Guiteau begins his assassination plot, he first considers using explosives, but due to the fear of being injured or even killed himself, he rejects the idea. He then considers stabbing Garfield, but also decides against it, as the latter was a pretty large man standing at 6 feet tall and could probably easily overpower the smaller framed Guiteau. It was finally decided he'd use a gun, and after borrowing some money, Guiteau would purchase his weapon of choice, a British Bulldog revolver. While Guiteau was planning his next steps of killing Garfield, he practiced shooting and even visited the local jailhouse he presumed himself to reside in after the deed was done. He would stalk and make multiple attempts to kill Garfield, but failed to do so for one reason or another. One notable instance is when he attempted to shoot Garfield while he attended church, but due to others surrounding him, he feared that some would get shot in the crossfire and backed off. Another instance came when he spotted Garfield and went to make the move, but stopped himself again after seeing the man's wife, who was very ill at the time. Guiteau, in his own words, didn't have the heart to do it, not wanting to upset her. What a gentleman. But after several weeks of nothing, Guiteau was done waiting. He had pre-written letters to be sent off that he killed President Garfield for the sake of the Republican Party, and that it was divine justice. Garfield's days were now numbered. It's July 2nd, 1881, a day that would change the life of Garfield and Guiteau forever. Garfield had traveled to the Baltimore-Potomac Railroad Station in Washington. He was going on a well-deserved vacation at a beach resort in New Jersey with his wife by his side. Guiteau, who had been alerted of this via the local newspaper, knew that today was his day. He had been keeping a close trail on the president's entourage, and when he arrived, Guiteau spared no second to make his next move. Looking around the busy train station, plenty of onlookers were in awe, excitedly waiting to see the president off. Guiteau patiently waited camouflaged with the groups of people, as if a wild animal hunting his prey. And then, he saw him. There stood James A. Garfield, the President of the United States, the man who shafted him a position he felt rightfully deserved to him, the man that was destroying the Republican Party and the United States, the man that Guiteau decided to execute. Guiteau swiftly moved in and got up close from behind. Unaware of his presence, Guiteau knew, at last, this was his chance. It was now or never. He pulled out his revolver, and he shot Garfield twice. Garfield collapsed, and Guiteau attempted to flee, but was quickly apprehended by police officers nearby, before shouting the haunting words, "I am the stalwart of stalwarts. Arthur is president now." Garfield was wounded, but did not die immediately, and his health fluctuated throughout several weeks. Due to the medical malpractices of the time, such as performing unsanitary procedures, Garfield would eventually develop sepsis. He would die of an aneurysm on September 19, 1881, 11 weeks after getting shot. It has long been asserted by historians that Garfield's gunshot wounds weren't actually fatal, and that had he been treated with proper medical care, he most likely would have survived, though there have been some counter-arguments to suggest otherwise. However, one thing is absolutely certain. His final weeks were agonizing, and he died a painful death, at the hands of a man who believed himself to be doing the right cause, for God's cause. At least, that's what Guiteau believed. Once it had been confirmed that Garfield had indeed died, Guiteau's charge had officially elevated from attempted murder to first-degree murder of President James A. Garfield. His trial commenced on November 17, 1882, and he pleaded not guilty. He insisted on representing himself, but was appointed an attorney regardless. This attorney's name was Leigh Robinson. He would retire from the case a week later. He was then appointed George Scoville, a lawyer who was also Guiteau's brother-in-law. Guiteau and Scoville argued the former not guilty by reason of insanity. Simple enough, right? No, it was not. See, tensions began to arise between Guiteau and his brother-in-law due to them posing different arguments. Scoville urged to claim medical insanity. Guiteau, however, claimed only to face temporary insanity, and that he wasn't actually crazy. He also claimed that God's spirit had taken over his body when he shot Garfield, and that he couldn't be held responsible. And the courts believed him. That is, they believed he wasn't insane at all, and that he was consciously aware of his actions. While on trial, Guiteau remained unbothered and unremorseful. He believed he had saved America from the wickedness that was James A. Garfield and that the killing was necessary, stating that God himself had given him the mission to take out the president. He even believed that he did Garfield's successor, Chester A. Arthur, a favor and would fully pardon him as a sign of gratitude. Yes, really. He was overconfident and smug. Guiteau's inflated sense of self was now larger than ever, as his case was extremely high profile, and for the first time in his life, he received a lot of attention. He thought himself to have many supporters on the outside, casually waving to the public while on trial. In reality, however, the public were anything but on his side, as they shared the same sentiment with the courts, wanting him hanged for his crimes. To add insult to injury, he also wrote letters that he planned to run for president in the 1884 elections. Guiteau will also callously argue that he didn't actually kill the president, but simply shot him, and that it was the doctor's malpractice that led to his death. While this is true, it is only so in the most technical sense. The fact of the matter is, Garfield wouldn't have even been in this situation to begin with if it weren't for Guiteau's direct and deliberate actions. And the court seemingly agreed, because on January 25th, 1882, Guiteau was found guilty for assassinating President James A. Garfield and was sentenced to death by hanging. Guiteau throughout this whole trial believed it to be nothing more than a mild inconvenience. His assuredness of soon being a free man with a promising future were quickly destroyed as the weight and grim reality of his situation had finally dawned upon him. And he didn't take that too well. He screamed and cursed at the jury while being dragged away. While awaiting his execution, Guiteau would attempt to appeal his case, to no success. He sent a letter to President Arthur urging him to be pardoned, believing that it was thanks to him that Arthur even had a job to begin with, and that once again he felt owed something. The pardon never came. Eventually, Guiteau would come to accept his fate. Knowing his days were now numbered, he would write poems justifying his actions, claiming that he was simply carrying out God's will, as if it absolves him of any wrongdoing. Guiteau was sent to be executed on June 30th, 1882. While on the way to the gallows, he remained casual and unbothered. It was clear in his final weeks that Guiteau had more or less mentally checked out and was fully indulging his own religious fantasies. Before being hung, he spoke his final words, and true to form, it was babbling about religion. And after reciting a poem, he made the signal, and the trapdoor opened, snapping his neck, killing him instantly. Charles Julius Guiteau is an anomaly to say the very least. From day one, he always believed himself to be destined for greatness, which in and of itself isn't inherently a negative quality. However, he took it to a whole nother level of grandiose. After his death, historians to this day continue to debate on whether Guiteau was actually insane or just egomaniacal. But to be honest, I think the answer is a pretty straightforward one. He was both. I do think that Guiteau was truly mentally unwell, and it's very possible that part of him genuinely did believe the rhetoric that he was spouting throughout his life. But I also think he was equally narcissistic. He believed himself to be better than everyone else and owed more than he actually deserved. He was a leech who really didn't stand for anything other than stroking his own ego. He wasn't successful in life, nor was liked by many people due to his overwhelmingly self-absorbed nature, and was constantly given reality checks that will all fall on deaf ears. And when he was rightfully put back in his place and his ego bruised for the final time, he snapped. He became so angry, he killed the very man who was meant to lead his own country because he couldn't stand the thought of rejection. At the same time, however, he often slipped away from any real consequences of his poor actions and often went unchecked, until he dug himself into a hole he couldn't climb out of. And even to that end, he never really did get it, never fully took responsibility. Instead, he constantly went on diatribes about how his actions were somehow justified, and even noble. And while I think he did, to a certain extent, believe his actions were just because he was mentally unstable, it's also textbook deflection, running away from the fact that he did a truly despicable act that he couldn't come back from, despite being supposedly a man of God and on the side of righteousness. But I think above all, he wanted to be recognized. He wanted people to finally see him, acknowledge his existence. Guiteau once said that he didn't fear death upon his mortal body, as his name would live on forever in history. And I suppose in that aspect, he was certainly right. He is one of the only 4 men to kill a president of the United States. If he were able to see this video today, I'd say he'd be delighted by someone actually talking about him. Then again, this video is more so critical of him, so maybe not so much. That said, he by no means is the most popular of the 4 assassins. He's vastly overshadowed by the legacies of John Wilkes Booth and Lee Harvey Oswald. And this is partly due to time. Both Lincoln and Kennedy had established themselves as popular presidents during trying times. Garfield, on the other hand, just wasn't in office long enough to make a lasting impact, and thus we don't know how he would have fared as president when the books were to be written. And in a way, it's sad. Garfield didn't even have a chance to bring something worthwhile to his country. He was robbed. And his legacy will forever be tied with Guiteau, a narcissistic, arrogant, and entitled but also incredibly mentally unstable man that would eventually lead them both to an utter tragedy that ultimately had no winners. This should have never happened. This is the United States of America, the land of the free, and the president leading their country to a brighter tomorrow. over. Thanks so much for watching. This thing took so many drawings, but I think it came out pretty good. I think this man's story was incredibly interesting while researching it. Do you believe Charles Guiteau was purely insane or purely egotistical? Both perhaps? Or maybe something completely different? All comments are greatly appreciated, and I will see you in the next one.